Please let's be seated. This is a panel concerning sculpture, and the unique thing about this panel is that 2 of the 5 panelists didn't show up. This is the first thing that's happened in my professional life. I thought people got cold feet at weddings, but evidently it happens on panels as well. So my name is Sunanda Sanio. I am Professor of Art History and Critical Studies at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this panel is on sculptural practices. So we have 3 panelists now, and so each person was supposed to have about 8 minutes. Now they can have twice as long. So each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes. Then we will see if we have any questions. To put it rather bluntly, it is impossible to write an exclusive history of modern sculpture. Though one could make the same argument about modern painting, it certainly is more relevant to sculpture. For unlike painting's occasional insistence on purity and self-critique, sculpture in the last century has been more consistently engaged in self-deconstruction, opening itself to complex dialogues with almost every other medium and expressive element: painting, photography, architecture, landscape, light, sound, motion, language, not to mention the human body. Sculptural practice today is thus infinitely more hybridized than the enterprise of painting. In fact, sculpture now is more a mode of representation than, precisely speaking, a medium. Of all the shifts that post-war sculpture went through in the latter half of the 20th century, interactivity has been instrumental in dismantling what used to be called the sculptural stasis. Interactions between a work of art and its audience can happen on multiple levels, via material, form, manipulation of space, through visual and sound effects, and so on. Interactivity makes a work of art something of an experience rather than something merely to be looked at from a distance. At the end of the day, it really matters less if one could call such projects sculpture. More important is the fact that they expand the conventional notion of sculpture to produce a rich discourse, contributing to what a legendary scholar once identified as the expanded field of sculpture. In the short time we have, well, now we don't. This was written before the 2 panelists didn't show up. So we have 3 artists now who experiment with a variety of approaches in sculptural practice to articulate statements about self, society, politics, and even about art itself. So each of them will focus on the issue of audience interaction or involvement in their work, and how material, process, and other approaches help in that audience interaction. And then how the work finds its place in the contemporary discourse of sculpture. So I shall introduce each participant, and they will present, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So, with an MFA in painting from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a BFA in the same from Maharaja Sayoji University in Baroda, India, Avantika Bawa is an artist, curator, and educator based in Portland, Oregon. Her solo exhibitions include shows at the Schneider Museum in Ashland, Oregon, Suama Arts Space in Seattle, Washington, and Atlanta Contemporary Art Center, and Nature Mode Gallery and Mascara Gallery in India. The Portland Art Museum will host a solo exhibit of Bawa's work in 2018. In April 2004, she was part of a team that launched Drain, a journal of contemporary art and culture. and she was appointed in 2014 to the board of the Oregon Arts Commission. Bawa is currently an associate professor of fine arts at Washington State University and in Vancouver, Washington. Avantika.
Hello, my name is Namita Gupta-Wigas. I'm here to entertain you with a bird on it. Just kidding. All right, now that I have this extra 5 minutes, I hope I don't go crazy. I'll try to stick to my time limit. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Sunanda, and your conversations on sculpture. Thank you to everyone at the Asia Society, Queen's Museum, Jayashree, the entire team. Prerna, she's been running around. Wherever you are, thank you. I've been seeing you working non-stop. And thanks to you guys, the audience. You're what matters. Because without you, we wouldn't exist. So yeah, as my introduction stated, I'm an artist, I'm an educator, I'm a traveler. I'm basically someone who's always navigating borders or navigating stuff, whether it's the boundary between painting and sculpture, the digital and the analog, a perfection, a distortion, something that's expected or something that is surrenderless. My practice as such emphasizes the intersections where drawing and sculpture, status and motion, the functional and the non-functional intermingle. Geographical, architectural and cultural differences in landscape strongly inform my work. I begin each of my drawings, which is a very intuitive and honest act, and then take this drawing and transform it into a sculptural gesture so that it reacts formally, physically, with a little bit of curiosity and humor to the space in which it occupies. This process of mine emerges due in part to my interest and my relationship and my love for minimalism, in spite of it being a big movement with the beautiful white boys. I do love the work that came out of it, and its emphasis on reductive form. As a person struggling with scale, physical scale, I'm talking about FAT. I believe in the reductive form and the modularity and also the literal scale of how artwork is often presented. I am the audience to my environment, whether it's right now in Queens, whether it's in Portland, Oregon tomorrow, or whether it's on my drive from Portland, Oregon to Washington, Vancouver, Washington, which is the drive I do every day. I am always responding to my environment, and my response to my environment is what forms the crux of my practice. Why do I do what I do, and who is my audience, and how much and how far do I consider it? Honestly, I have no calculated answer, but at the core, and at the beginning, and at the end of any kind of making, my curiosities and interests have pretty much always been the same. It is my environment, my geography, my architectural landscape, whether it's the interior of a building or the exterior of a ruined facade, that strongly informs my work. I respond to these spaces, these landscapes, these oddities with form, color, shape, space through a conversation with the site. Yes, I am a formalist, but the work I make and the journey of the audience viewing and interacting with the work is also what takes the work to a whole new level and informs the next thing I do. So for me, it's like a conversation. The environment gives me a question, I respond, the audience interjects, works with it, or contradicts it, and that takes me to the question or a trigger of making the next thing that I do. In this 3-year journey, aquamapping, the conversations that I had with the people I worked with the people who saw it, certainly took the work to a whole new level and kept informing the work as it progressed. It was probably the longest project I have ever worked on, the most elaborate, and I had to deal with video and photo. So for those of you who work with video, kudos, I don't know how you do it. So aquamapping is a series of 3 art interventions in 3 different locations that responds to the site's coastal history, topography, and climate. Part 1, aquamapping, which is what you see here, engages with the routes of maritime trade in southern India, as well as the routes of local fishing vessels and passenger ferries. These are a few stills from aquamapping Cochin. Part 2, Aquamapping Baltimore and Annapolis, explores the commercial and military routes in the waters of the Inner Harbor and Chesapeake Bay around Baltimore and Annapolis. And I love that the Naval Academy is in the background over here. And Part 3, Aquamapping Astoria, Oregon, highlights the rugged coastline of this historic port city and the graveyard of the Pacific. It's called the graveyard because a lot of ships that would enter couldn't really exit without sea pilots because of the topography. The routes that each of these vessels that I towed my ball to were partly informed by journeys of historic, commercial, and military significance. Essentially, I was interested in what happens when these conceptual markers and borders, reminders of past and present, geographical, military, and cultural boundaries become part of the physical landscape. How do they confront the viewer with these histories and provoke questions of significance and authenticity in relationship to geographic technologies like the Google Pin and GPS? So if you haven't figured out by now, this was my big ball of a GPS, moving from one point to another. These documented journeys, presented through a combination of still images, audio and video projections, attempted to actualize the dotted lines that serve as signifiers for routes on these maps. While on a larger scale, this project addresses travel cartography through an integration of sound and video. The visitor is further encouraged to zoom in on its formal elements and explore individual aspects like the monumentality or lack thereof when the ball disappears, and the color of this ball set against the expanse of the sea, as well as field recordings of the water. All these things happen as I bring my collective experiences in the form of photos, videos, etc. to the gallery as documentation as well as artifact. And once I do, these conversations and curiosities of my journeys, my spaces, and my absurd choices to take a big ball and tow it across Cochin and Baltimore, all these conversations begin. Why do you have a big ball? What does it mean? Well, it actually doesn't mean anything. It's a big orange ball. It's a big orange ball that is like your GPS. Why are you taking it across this route? Well, this is the route that Christopher Columbus thought he would take when he landed on India, but thought he was landing somewhere else. Why are you taking it across this route in Annapolis? Oh, because I wanted to see if the Naval Academy would give me permission, and they did. Why are you doing this big ball across Astoria? Because it looks really pretty, and that's all I really want. So when I do these things, I eventually then presented them as, like I said, video, and in this case, a screen and digital print. And even in these presentations, I'm thinking about how the image is a little off. My slide is very perfectly centered, but this off-kilter approach, and thinking about how a cursor marks at things, a post-it is marking at things, all of these things, how they inform our act of looking, seeing, and receiving information. All these visual, physical clues become part of my collective visual package. And when I take these experiences inside, like over here, this is a triple projection at the White Box Gallery in Oregon. And I liked how it worked in this very cold, collected space. And then I juxtapose it against another presentation on a high-rise building in Mumbai with the Arabian Sea in the background. So in this case, the project was across many different cities and countries, but it was eventually presented in cities that it wasn't documented in, which is very different from my next project called Flood Control, which I did about 3 years ago. In this piece, this is also another site-specific installation, intervention. I use the history and geography behind the formation of Emigrant Lake. There is something called Emigrant Lake, and it's on Dead Indian Highway. So the minute I was told that there's this big fake lake, and when it was built, Dead Indian Highway disappeared, I was like, okay, I know what I'm working on. So Emigrant Lake on Dead Indian Highway Memorial Road in Ashland, Oregon formed the crux of flood control. Emigrant Lake is a reservoir that was created in 1924 to irrigate the land for new settlers and was expanded in 1960. In the process of expansion, the entire town of Willamette Junction as well as the old Siskiyou Highway, including the Dead Indian Highway, were flooded and submerged. The contrast between the sublime beauty, because it is really gorgeous, and its controversial history, its location at the boundary of the natural and the fabricated, were thus explored. I created very carefully a staged representation of this big blue expanse in the form of a big blue swath. And in the process, I also wanted to acknowledge the influence of theater arts in Ashland, Oregon. Ashland, Oregon is home for the largest Shakespeare festival in the US. Flood control comprised of this big painted panoramic blue swath that spans all four walls of the space, and the green shelving structure that it appears to be supporting is really just floating below it. The shelf traverses the walls and ends on the floor where it rests on a rock. The abrupt ending of the shelf alludes to a highway that was lost in the process of flooding, and this singular rock, borrowed from the actual site of the lake, aims to serve as a visual anchor in the gallery space. Collectively, these components dodge the rules of linear perspective, which is something I teach a lot in my classes, and I like to mess with it in my own work. And in the process of distorting this linear perspective, it distorts or construes our understanding of scale, proportion, and what is leveled. The only true level element in this piece is this thin blue line, which I hope you guys can see. This line evokes both the residual high watermarks of a flooded interior and a deliberate chalk mark by a construction worker. So these are a few photographs and screen prints that were also part of the installation. Since my work is so temporary, the only way it exists after the installation is destroyed is through photo documentation. But with every installation, I'm either making drawings or photo prints that serve as true documentation because they also capture the experience of making the installation and not just a final document. The show also created a platform for several performance artists and musicians who created works in the space in response to the idea of being submerged. Experimental audio performances, vocal performances, etc., and stuff that students from the neighboring university could do as a way of engaging with the space. So the work became a prop, which is totally fine by me. The more the audience can engage with my dead, open, cold, formal blobs, great, and I get more press, because that's what we want, right? So I'm going to end with a very recent installation, which I did last year as part of the Portland Biennial, curated by Michelle Grabner, so that was a nice little thing. This was at the Astor Hotel in Astor, Astoria, and the hotel is very derelict, broken, and in the process of being reconstructed, and it has a very sad and bleak economic past. Mineral Spirits in the decayed and darkened lobby of the Astor Hotel is a location of an assemblage of non-functional scaffolds and recorded sounds. These are scaffolds that I purchased and painted painstakingly over a 10-day period in a fake Ralph Lauren gold. In fact, I just found a color chip in my bag. I was like, great. The scaffolds painted in soft metallic gold hint at the hotel's glorious past. The history of the Astor Hotel is long and complicated, full of highs and lows and a tremendous number of setbacks. For its grand opening in 1924, a special fleet of automobiles was deployed to transport out-of-town marketing muck for the train station to the hotel. In less than 45 years, the building was declared a public nuisance and a fire hazard. It is still the tallest building in coastal Oregon. Stage lighting and residual natural sunlight interact to produce subtly changing shadows of the scaffold on the floor and on the ceiling. Stretches of silence are interrupted with modified field recordings of the construction of the scaffold, invoking spirits of the guests past and present. So I titled the work Mineral Spirits because the first material I used to clean the scaffold when I bought it was a mineral spirit, but I also thought it made sense within the context of it hinting at the past. Oops. As critic Jennifer Rabin, who is a writer from Oregon, says, without offering details, this installation conveys the entire arc of the building from its inception during the Gilded Age to its current state of urban decay. Everything about this installation explores contradictions inherent in the hotel story. The rise and fall of any great thing, light and shadows, silence and noise, presence and absence, grandeur and disintegration. Even the construction soundtrack could be mistaken for one of destruction. So while this installation was occupying the space, I had recorded sounds of the building of the construction of the scaffold, so it was just a lot of clickety-clack and metal, and I would play it back, so if you walk through the space on your own, it did get a little spooky and you didn't know if anyone was up there or not. But that was it, and it was kind of simple to finally do an installation where there was nothing besides just the object itself and intermittent audio playing in the background. And that just gives you a sense of what the structure looks like. And Americans consider this building very old, but as an Indian, I was like, it's actually not that old. But still, it was really fun working on this installation, and I love jumping, so I got a lot of time to jump up and down that scaffold without breaking my back. And with that, I would say thank you. Do you get this? Sorry. It's like one.
Thank you, Avantika. Next is Ruby Chisti, born in Jung and educated at the National College of Art in Lahore. Ruby Chisti is currently based in New York. She is primarily a representational sculptor. Chisti's work is deeply influenced by losses and crises in her own family and the social and political climate of contemporary Pakistan. Over the last 18 years, she has produced a series of lyrical sculptures and installations that touch on Islamic myths, gender politics, migration, memory, and the universal theme of love and loss. Outside the US, her work has been exhibited in both group and solo shows in the UK, India, Pakistan, Spain, and Hong Kong. Finally, her work has been published in numerous magazines and newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune, New York Times, and in a number of books. Ruby.
Thank you so much for being here. I think I'm having it. Okay. Trained as a sculptor in Western classical manner, the wood, stone, clay, plaster, and bronze, these materials did not seem enough to hold my content. So in 1999, I started to feel a connection between the piles of cast-off, leftover pieces and other scraps of fabric that I had collected over the years, and a human body who, in spite of my constant struggle, was still deteriorating. During the last year of my mother's life and my impending loss, I started making work with these materials while she would sleep. I had a history of meticulously stitching my own clothes, altering my siblings' clothing, and making cloth dolls in my childhood. I started transforming these piles of clothing into doll-like sculptures. These cloth sculptures would tell the stories about love, loss, mortality, childhood memories, and gender disparities. I was using straw to stuff these forms like the folk and children's toys of their time, which were meant to perish after a certain period of play. This autobiographical work responds to a sense of rejection experienced born as a fourth daughter in a patriarchal society. These doll-like women seated in a circle and mourning over the birth of a girl child. The fabric comes from the old quilts of my family members. I deliberately chose fabric as my material in order to extend the craft and skill of sewing, which was considered to be a feminine and low art, into my practice. The idea of using humble materials is derived from a way of life in which humility is a much coveted goal. Male Punjabi Sufi poets would adopt the female voice because the woman was considered inferior in society. The work addresses gender disparities and tries to bridge the gap between the doll-making tradition of the Indian subcontinent and the contemporary sculpture. The work was so accessible even to the housemaids, the person who sweep the floor in the gallery, to the intellectual people. So it seemed to be that one of my biggest challenge of making work and showing is that it should be interpreted or it should be communicated. I change my materials according to my content. So when my content changes, my material changes as well. I was looking for a material which has something to do with reproduction. So I thought about using the sanitary napkins in my work, and I created a little newborn baby in a sanitary napkin. So I created first in clay the face, and then made molds out of plaster, and then cast the layers of sanitary napkins. So the result was quite interesting. I realized that whatever material you want to work with, somehow it has its own limitations, but it also gives certain direction that you have never explored before. So I made this turban, a man's, of course, in Pakistan. The turban is a very a symbol of pride and dignity. Somehow I wanted to make it with a feminine material. Just to see that how women's contribution throughout the centuries, how it is seen. Okay. This work is called Sketch of a Fading Memory. It's a site-specific work fashioned from fallen twigs that I had gathered while walking around in the streets of Karachi. I was using the sensibility of birds making nests. I came across the abandoned nests of sparrows filled with the flower petals. This is another version of the same idea. The obvious visual reference is Madonna and Child, but as the title suggests, the work is autobiographical. It's a self-portrait and my mother, whose body exhausted by a long illness and hospitalization is locked in the embrace with her child and caregiver. Reclaiming a religious image of divine motherhood, which has been created countless times by male artists in the employ of the church, and reworking it with a feminine personal narrative, but the roles of mother and child are reversed. This is another detail. I was very liberated when I was working with this material because it put me sort of in a state in which I was not answerable to things like preserving it or archiving or preserving it or selling it or whatever. So the works were destroyed, meant to be destroyed at the end of the exhibition. This is a life-size crow. Crow is a recurring motif in my work, although it's a messenger and a harbinger of guests in our culture in Pakistan and India. My personal symbol is a witness, as it carries the knowledge of the past, and so it's like a companion for me. Whenever I have shown these works in the galleries or spaces outside or wherever, people have different experiences and they bring that to me and share with me the stories regarding and myths regarding this creature. Their unusual presence inside the space sometimes irritates the viewer or make them think of as if something has happened, because crows usually gather when there is some alarming situation or something. When I was in London showing in a gallery, a gentleman came up to me and asked if I know about the ravens of the Tower of London. The presence of 2 captive ravens is believed to protect the crown and the tower. A superstition that holds that if ravens are lost or fly away, the crown will fall and the Britain with it. So the crows are made with the leftover pieces of my old clothing or the scraps that I collect. And sometimes I'm wearing the same clothes as the crows are. So it's kind of interesting. This work I made in response to what was happening in Pakistan around 2007, 2008 when Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. I was so much into the internet those days that I used to watch all the time the news. I was connected to each moment was happening in Pakistan, and while watching live, I saw that the bomb blast happened and the people were, killed. I couldn't believe my eyes. It seemed to me that it's hard to differentiate between the reality and the fiction, or which is just animation or something. And I was so touched by that. And when I was making this work, I used bridal clothing and bridal embellishments like gota and other things to make fire in this piece. And I also was thinking that when the climate is so harsh and brutal and so devastating, even the mythical creature like Barak would also be wounded. This is another detail. This work is called Free Hugs, which was inspired by a man giving free hugs in a public place. And I wanted to create, I wanted to look up into what is hug about and why people hug each other. So this work, I made figures on a very small scale, so just to elevate the viewer and give him or her the godlike presence. This is another view. Here I cut up an old military uniform and created this little girl sculpture, and I also incorporated the leftover pieces at garbage where I was invited in Azerbaijan from the Waste to Art residency. I cast and then I made it very realistically and painted on it. When I came to New York, I was very overwhelmed by the fashion and architecture. So I started to incorporate fashion clothing into my work and transform the ready-made garments into sculptural form that would suggest the absence of a body. home that I had been carrying with me for years. I wanted to wear it, telling the stories where I come from and trying to blend myself into the skyscrapers of New York. I stood silently at the intersections and I took apart clothes of unknown people and saw them together, transforming them into architectural forms which were also wearable. The present is a ruin without a people, is an audiovisual installation that explores the physical and emotional spaces unwillingly abandoned by individuals in the time of conflict and war, primarily focusing on the cathartic aspect of destruction and construction, into sprawling architectural forms carefully chosen and assembled. I treat each scrap of fabric with the same care that I would offer the humans who once wore them. I experimented with new ways of placing myself into the world. I also incorporated the sound in it so that when viewers get closer to it, they could hear the ambience of emptiness. This is the last word. These hundreds of miniature tents scattered but stitched all over the bedding and pillow. Speaking of the dignity the loss of dignity of people who are displaced. And just a minute. I feel that processing contemporary anxieties as we continue to witness the horrors of war and displacement and a stark disconnect with our own comfortable lives. Thank you.
Okay, down to our last presenter in the absence of the other two people. Trinidadian-born Romy Schroeder has an MFA in sculpture from the University of the Arts, Philadelphia, and a BFA in ceramics from Florida Atlantic University. Her studio practice since 2007 has used the chair as a stand-in for the human form, transforming their utility through a complex process of cutting, altering, sanding, and reassembling. The underlying themes that drive her practice come from her interest in the human condition, such as relationships with others, the fractured psyche, and emotions. Romy.
Thank you, Samanda. Thank you, Jayshree, wherever you are. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on such a beautiful, sunny summer day. I was trying to see if we can get the internet on here so I can show you some of my older work since we are only 3 now, but I'll work with what I have. Technology is not really my strong suit, so I'll stick to what I know. So, as my bio say, Sunanda had just explained, my focus, my art practice is, at least the object is the chair. Growing up, child of the 60s, 70s, I was pretty much immersed in design culture. I think that was the height of modern and contemporary design. And coming from a tiny island the size of Delaware, with very heavy influence of Indian culture, as well as English culture, as well as Caribbean culture, I was privy to a lot of interesting textiles, shapes, colors, everything coming at me. And as a child, I was a keen observer. I always liked to sit back and watch and gather information to then, you know, figure out how to do things later. So as all of these objects came into my, my pathway, I interacted with them, and I also paid attention to the way other people interacted with these objects. Getting to grad school, same thing, I just kind of played with objects. My first object that I took and played with was the pillow, because I found that I could never find the right pillow to sleep on. I always have neck problems. And you would think if I can't find these things, I would design them, but make no mistake, I am not a designer. Actually, I am a designer. I design children's footwear, but as an artist, I stick to taking things apart, taking things that are already there, and working to bring them into a minimal, to strip away what the function is, and to bring through the essence of what I see as beauty. Maybe some kind of poetry in the object as opposed to the function. So I'm going to click through some of these images. So this was a project that I did on Governor's Island a few years ago, and I deem it as my most successful public project only because I was there to witness. Speaking of audience, I became one of the biggest audience, the biggest viewer for my own work. Whereas before in museums and galleries, you install the work, you say thank you, you go to the opening, and then you never know what happens in the gallery unless somebody's filming it, then you see it on Google later, but that doesn't really happen that much. But this was Governor's Island. It's a beautiful place to be in the summertime, so I just took the ferry, and I sat there with my camera and just watched to see what happened. I'm not sure how this is looking on your screen. It's big enough. So they asked me to do a project, and it had to be interactive. Now, before this project, all of my pieces were singular objects, so it would be a chair that no one can sit in. So it was essentially a very minimalist, very modern-looking sculpture. This challenge to create something that was going to come back to a function was interesting to me. So I created the 13 chairs in a sort of snaking position that allow the sitter to engage with a companion in a very unusual way for sitting. Growing up, I'm sure we've all, have been relegated to, you sit in that chair, you face in one direction, your arms and your hips are in line, your legs are in front of you, and your eyes are forward, like pretty much all of you are right now. I wanted to take that concept of that functionality and distort it. So the chairs, as you can see, are leaning and tilting. Some of them are extremely close to each other, and it asks the sitter to be courageous. Sometimes, in public, we tend to be a little bit courageous in what we can, I think, deem, what's the word? For lack of a better word, okay to, sit on. And we sit on tables, we sit on platforms or stairs. I always have this problem when I'm taking the subway, people are always sitting on the stairs, and in my mind I'm like, this is not the best place to sit. So I asked the sitter to just, be playful in the sitting, and people really were. Some of them weren't, and on days that I noticed that no one was sitting, people were mostly taking pictures, or just, there would be a group of 5 people, and one would sit there, one would sit here, one would sit here, and I would ask them, well, you guys all know each other, why wouldn't you come together as a group and sit together? And they said, well, it looks uncomfortable, or I would have to sit really close to that person. And I said, but when you're on the train, when you're on the train, everyone in New York is so close, and here we are in an open space, and nobody wants to sit close together. But I realized that the sitting close together was something that is also, in a way, private. So here I am, I made people sit in a very public space, very close together. So the picture, that's me with a friend. This was a really funny one because I'm sitting with my legs completely straddled, so I have one leg that way and one leg that way, and she essentially has to sit between my legs. You know, no one wanted to sit in that configuration there, but she was brave enough to do it with me. This one was interesting. This viewer is blind, and I watched him for a long time sort of feel his way around the sculpture, which was a different level that I didn't even think about. And it was really interesting. I wish I'd filmed it instead of just, you know, watching at the end where he found his spot. So he's perching at the very back of the chair, which is leaning forward and down. And he sat there for quite a while. I think his family or friends or companions just kind of left him there and they went on to do their thing. But it was interesting to see a sightless person find interaction in this sculpture that asks you to sit in a very, you know, unconventional way. I didn't think that the work was going to be as engaging and as playful as it turned out to be. So on the days that I wasn't there or, you know, I wasn't able to catch everyone, a lot of people did their own photography and their own playfulness, and then later on either they sent the images to me, because on that black or that orange box over here there's my information. So they sent me these pictures of them having fun with the chair, or I would just find it on the internet. There's a couple that I found of a guy joggling, you know, through the whole chair configuration, which I thought was really interesting. Let's see, and the last slide I have here is, I think the first time pretty much all of the seats were filled up and people were really engaging. So as far as my work goes, my public work tends to be very interactive, something I never thought I would you know, bring into my studio practice. I'm a very solitary person, and though I tend to like being around a lot of people, it's been a very challenging project to think about outdoor sculpture, interaction, and also the longevity of the pieces that tend to go out and get, you know, rattled on, climbed on. So the concept of, you know, playing with this interaction, I think, is something that we're going to discuss next on the panel. And I would like to hear, you know, from my peers too about their, you know, their feeling about this interaction in public art and sculpture. Thank you.
Why did you guys come on? So, what I'm going to do is what was not done on the other panels. Nothing against that, but I think that questions should come from the audience. So I would definitely, we have what, like 10 minutes for lunch. So, you know, I'd welcome questions from the audience about the work of any of them, or a common question for all of them.
This question is actually for Ruby Chishti. So I just loved the idea of using feminine, you know, stitching and clothes to sort of depict the kind of work that happens in feminist spaces, or the kind of feelings that are not usually displayed, you know, sort of in mixed spaces, especially in the South Asian context. So I was wondering, so when you have shows, say, in Pakistan, how do women react to your sort of airing of, say, sanitary napkins or, things like that? I'm really interested in that kind of interaction with the audience.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. When I was making that work in a residency in Karachi, I was thinking the same thing because it was like almost 5-6 years since I moved here. I could hear things what were happening in Pakistan, but did not experience myself. So I was a little bit worried how people would receive it, especially the very religious people, because the form of the piece is like a man's material, man's wearable. It's a turban, and it's made of sanitary napkins. But it's a very interesting thing that because of the content which is loaded, people could understand what I'm trying to say. So nobody was felt that it's not very pleasant thing to look at, or even one person who collected it, he said that he's going to wear it because that was wearable. So I think the content was very much obvious in the piece, and I think that crossed the barriers between us and the work and the viewer, I guess.
This is also audience related. Have you had children respond to your works? Because children is without preconceptions, and mostly a very fresh response to things. So I'm curious if you have had children, and have you observed them as they respond to your works?
In that particular work or overall work? I don't have children, but I love children. While living in Pakistan, first of all, as I experienced myself as a child, a very different experience that usually children would do. I would spend most of my time in nature because I could have the freedom that children usually did not have, because I was not a focus of attention, so would sort of, spend time in outside. But my interest in sort of depicting children, or as a not having children, it is a lot to talk about, because when I took care of my mother for 11 years, who was paralyzed, could not talk, could not sit, and she was just like a newborn child, and she remained like that for 11 years. But when you have a child, they grow up, they sort of start to develop, but her situation was deteriorating. So I think in that way I could have experienced having a child, and it had a very strong impact, I think, on my art practice as well. I hope this answered the question.
What about the other ladies? Have you had children respond to your work?
They jump on it, they jump across it, and that's fine as long as they don't break their bones. Because at the end I'm breaking it all down anyway. So whether it's a scaffold or a big beam. But I also get really annoyed if people touch it on the day of the opening, because I want my perfect yellow or perfect blue to be untouched. So I can be very mean and also very friendly and encouraging, or rebelling. Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. For me especially, because I fear children near, fragile, sharp objects. As I'm sure their parents do too. So part of being accepted to a lot of these outdoor sculpture pieces, safety has always been the dynamic that takes over more of the artwork talk. So yes, I've experienced children jumping on the artwork. And part of it, I think about, like, when does it turn into a jungle gym and when is it art? You know, there's always that discussion in the back of my head. Am I making work for the amusement park, or am I making sculpture for, you know, a larger discourse about social interactions and politics and, you know, all of that stuff? And yes, when does it become this object that kids come and jump on, kick, break, all of these things? But adults do that too.
I have just to add this. I think I did not hear you properly. You talked about how children interact to the work. It's very interesting that I have so many experience with my work and the children. One time I was displaying the work in the gallery, and I had made a little baby with stockings and stuffed with polyester, and it looked very realistic baby, but it had a sort of a bomb kind of thing attached to it, which was not actual, but it was just and a little girl with her mom came, and she came up and she picked that baby and started running as if she's going to take it with her. And so I think children are very fascinated with the kind of work. And also when I was wearing that architecture and walking in the intersections, children would like to touch, and they would relate that to their doll's house and you know, speak about that a little. And especially I think they were very interested because they have seen something like that.
Okay, I guess we are hungry, so we have time for one more question. Now go ahead, please.
It was pretty much along the same lines, so you touched on something I wanted to ask about. So good.
Okay, so thanks a lot for asking, and thank you very much.
So I just want to announce for all the people who are presenting and moderating, lunch is served for you up there. For those of you who are here as attendees, there's the cafe, and they have lots of yummies there. But if you're presenting today or you're presenting tomorrow, either way, please do join us for lunch. You can pick up your badges to let you in if you need it.